Bonjour à tous and welcome to this second video on French relative pronouns. This time we'll be talking about donc and ou. Now, if you're not already familiar with the relative pronouns qui and que, I highly recommend that you watch my video on those first for two reasons. Number one, qui and que are more important than donc and ou. And number two, we'll be using concepts learnt in the qui and que video to help us use donc. So it'd be really helpful if you watch that one first. If you have already watched it or you are already comfortable with qui and que, let's move on with donc. Now essentially, donc is que for verbs followed by de. So if you know how to use que, you know how to use donc. The only difference is you need to know whether a verb is followed by de or not. So for example, to speak about something in French is parler de quelque chose. Now knowing this is simply a case of knowing. There is no magic formula, you just have to know that to speak about something is parler de quelque chose. Now a lot of people in trying to use a relative pronoun in this case will do the following. Let's say we want to say the situation that I'm speaking about. They will identify the relative pronoun as that. They know that the verb is am speaking, the subject of the verb is I, and the object is the situation. And based on the rules of qui and que, we have object plus the relative pronoun. We have the situation, the object of the verb, followed by that, the relative pronoun. And so they will say something like la situation que je parle or la situation que je parle de. Now, yes, you've correctly used the rules that we learned in the qui and que video. You've got object, relative pronoun, and so you use que. But the problem is this verb is followed by de, and we can't put the de at the end. Some people might say la situation que je parle de, thinking that the de and the about are the same. But unlike in English, we can't put the about part at the end. We cannot end this clause with a preposition. Okay? Instead, we have to include the idea of de somewhere in the middle, and we do that by replacing que with donc. La situation dont je parle, and the word dont kind of carries the meaning of the de, and so we don't need to put the word de anywhere. So la situation dont je parle, the situation that I'm speaking about, or perhaps more technically, the situation about which I am speaking. Okay, how about this one? To discuss something is discuter de quelque chose. So if we want to say the problem that we are discussing, you'll say le problème dont on discute or le problème dont nous discutons, the latter being slightly more formal. Okay, so notice there's actually no sign of de anywhere because of the word dont carries the meaning of de. We also have the word de qui, which for all intents and purposes is donc, but for people. So if we wanted to say the person that I'm speaking about, we would say la personne de qui je parle. However, it is equally as acceptable to use the word dont. You could say la personne dont je parle. In the same way that in English we can say I know a man who is a doctor, or I know a man that is a doctor. Really, there's not much difference. People aren't too worried. But the who, like the de qui, is perhaps slightly more appropriate. But really, you're quite free to use either one. Donc can also be used to mean whose, in which case it is always followed by an article. So for example, you could say the man whose car was stolen would be l'homme dont la voiture a été volée. The article here is really important, and its gender depends on the gender of the word that comes after it. So the word voiture is feminine, and so we use la. L'homme dont la voiture a été volée. Similarly, we could say the woman whose hat is green, la femme dont le chapeau est vert. So this time chapeau is masculine, and so we say dont le. What's important is you cannot say la femme dont chapeau est vert, you need the le. It might sound a little bit weird because in English we don't say who's the hat, okay, but in French you need that article. Now you can quite happily think of this just as meaning the word whose, right? You don't need to think of it as a relative pronoun. Do know that in this case, we don't mean whose as a question, okay? You can't say dont le chapeau est, meaning whose hat is this. That doesn't work, okay? It is not a question, it is only mid-sentence. But you don't need to think of it as a relative pronoun, you can just think whose is dont le, dont la, or dont les. Then we move on to où, which is relatively simple because it is a relative pronoun that refers to place and time. So we don't need to think too grammatically about this. We just need to remember that if we're talking about a place or a time, we use où. Okay, so for example, the place that or the place where we met is l'endroit où on s'est rencontrés. Okay, or l'endroit où nous nous sommes rencontrés, depending on how formal you want to be. So I think that makes a lot of sense because we know où to mean where. What might be a little bit strange is that we can also use où to mean time. So the day that or the day when we met, whichever in English, in French would be le jour où on s'est rencontrés or le jour où nous nous sommes rencontrés. So literally what we're saying is the day where we met, okay, which sounds a little bit odd, but you can't use the word quand as a relative pronoun, okay? Quand is a question word, it is not a relative pronoun. If you need to say when, or you're referring to a time, in French you will use où as your relative pronoun. So I know I went through things a little bit quickly there, but I'm trying to show you that really, once you've understood qui and que, dont and où and all the rest are relatively easy to understand, okay? If you understand the concept of subject, verb, object, you understand the concept of verbs being followed by de, verbs being followed by a, etc., etc., etc. This is all relatively simple. We're following the same rules, we're just using slightly different words. Of course, if you do have any questions, please do not hesitate to put them in the comments. I'm always happy to help people who are struggling, of course. There will be another video on relative pronouns that will come afterwards, but for now, have some practice with these. Try and master them as best you can before you move on, and until next time, à bientôt.